Season 3, Episode 1. My name is Peter Cole, and I am a Microsoft App Dev Specialist based in Sydney. It is great to welcome everyone back in the new year. I have been growing out my beard out in isolation, so I look forward to a more open 2021. And for those of you that are new to AzureDIY, this is a community event run by the Microsoft App Dev team. This is intended to be a open brown bag session / training weekly sessions over lunch. And we leverage the community to pretty much come up with the topics you guys want. So every season, at the end of every season, we ask for feedback through a form of what topics you want for the next season, and that's what this is built around. Before we kick off, of course, a little bit of housekeeping. Based on feedback from season 2, season 3 will be run a little bit differently. Instead of an hour and 15 minutes, we're going to do everything in 1 hour, including question time. During the session, please post any questions you have in the chat, and the App Dev team will try and answer them as we go. And then the last 5 minutes or so of the talk, the speaker will pick a few questions to talk through. This session is a live event and it is recorded. The recording will be put on YouTube, on our YouTube channel and our LinkedIn page. And this evening, or today, we have a fantastic treat for you with Lyons from the Logic Apps product group, who will be going to be talking through a bunch of different updates and exciting changes happening in Logic Apps. But before we get to that, just kind of what's happening this season. So today, of course, is Logic Apps with Beck. Next week, we have Val coming in chatting through your first slice of Raspberry Pi. This is our IoT conversation. So it's about getting started with IoT. So if you have any projects or you're thinking about getting into the IoT space, that's a perfect session for you. This is the longest season that we've run up to this point. We've got 9 sessions in total, so please make sure you're on top of them and check them out on our LinkedIn page as well. If you haven't already, please join our growing LinkedIn community. We've updated with all the events on LinkedIn, so if you sign up, you should get notified about the events happening weekly, and you can also register through LinkedIn as well. Please share that with any of your team members or anyone that you think would be interested in skilling up over these weekly sessions. Before I hand over to Beck, just a few Azure updates. Well, Kubernetes update in general. Good to know that Docker as an underlying runtime is being deprecated in favor of runtimes that use the container runtime interface CRI. So if you're out there running your own Kubernetes, you got to maybe double check those clusters and make sure everything's still up to date. AKS and should be fine, but it's good to know. API management and Key Vault. So Azure API management certifications are that's now GA for getting managed through Azure Key Vault. So you can manage, rotate, and your certifications, and you can of course share your certifications through a bunch of different services. So if you want to check out more updates, check out this link, this QR code here, and that will take you to the Azure Updates page. Awesome. I will now jump over to Beck Lyons.
Awesome. Thank you very much, everyone. It's lovely to be here. So I'm just going to share my screen. So yes, Beck Lyons, I have been a Microsoftie for almost 5 years. Originally working with the team here, and now I'm a program manager in the Logic Apps team. Still based in Melbourne, so you still have me kind of walking around the CBD and around. I tell you, it's a lot nicer to be here than it is in the US at the moment. So kind of lucky stars that I can still be part of the team and working remotely. So in terms of what I cover in the Logic Apps team, I cover all things developer experience related, DevOps, some of the new and up and coming features yet to be announced, and some other fun and games in between. In my own time, what keeps me happy is I love video games and I love bouldering. So get to balance my time between, sitting on my bum and also getting out there and being active. So that's a bit about me. This is a bit about what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm from the Logic Apps product team, and it's my absolute pleasure to be representing all the amazing work that has been done over the past couple of months and years to bring Logic Apps to what it is today. If you haven't heard already, Logic Apps is currently in a public preview for a lot of new functionality that takes what we've been developing over years worth of Logic Apps, and we're enhancing functionality for integration specialists, generalists, developers, and essentially anyone that needs orchestration within their enterprise application suite. So I'm going to talk about the general Azure Integration Services suite and platform and how Logic App fits in. I'm also going to talk about when to use Logic Apps and where and when not to, as compared to something like Data Factory or Power Automate. And then I'm going to go through and show you some of the new functionality with Logic Apps. So I'll go through the new designer, the new experience, some of the cool integration features that we've got, all the new features for developers, running Logic Apps anywhere with containers, and connecting Logic Apps to anything with all the latest and greatest networking features that we've added on. I may not get time to walk through everything, but I've got links for resources for further research and reading afterwards. So with that in mind, feel free to pump in questions to the chat as we go along. I'll get to any outstanding ones at the end, but the lovely team will be answering as many as they can as I talk. So setting the scene of where we are with integration. Now, I think we can all agree that integration isn't what it used to be. Many organizations started out in the integration game 20 plus years ago, mainly with plug and play monolithic type solutions. You're thinking, for example, like a BizTalk server where everything goes in and everything goes out. It's that single point of integration across all your different business applications that were traditionally within your network boundary on-prem. Now, over the years, things have changed, so we need to change the way that we do our integrations. Now, some of those trends that are pushing us to change the way that we do things are things such as mobile. People are expecting to have access to their applications and behind the scenes data as they would if they were on their premises, and they want that from wherever they are in the world. I think last year was a testament to that. SaaS applications, we're moving more of those traditionally on-premises server-based applications and outsourcing that to our SaaS providers, examples being Office 365, Salesforce, Dynamics. The cloud, we are moving some of those monolithic on-premises based applications to more dispersed and microservices-based applications on the cloud, taking advantage of cloud-native services such as serverless technologies, which is increasing the demand on our integration services as there's a lot more components needing integration. And of course, we've got things like IoT and big data. Essentially, in a nutshell, we've got more applications dispersed over more different locations, more devices, and with more data than ever before. So it calls into question traditional means of integration. That plug and play single point of integration just doesn't cut it anymore. And we need to think about how we can scale and vertically integrate across everything that we do. So at Microsoft, we believe integration is built in and part of everything that we do. Integration isn't just kind of an afterthought, it should be built into everything that your business does. So as a developer, you're thinking about integrations as you're building your applications. As a business, you're thinking about how you're exposing your data out to different partners through APIs. And how we connect to our SaaS applications, how do we bridge out to IoT, and how do we hook all that data and insights into our data and analytics platform so that we can take insights from that and grow and learn as a company. Good, breathing through what we need from an integration platform in general. And for Microsoft, we have the Azure Integration Services platform that you might have seen before. This is essentially the requirements that you need as a modern organization for modern integration to facilitate the demands of all those different trends that I mentioned earlier. So you're going to need an eventing type platform where you can pump events into and react upon those events, particularly for any real-time application development that you're developing. You're going to need ETL, taking data from one place to another, enriching it, transforming it, getting it ready for actual consumption by your downstream applications. APIs, no introduction there. We are in an API economy. We're not building things from scratch anymore. We're now putting the Lego pieces together to build end-to-end experiences, and APIs at the core of that. Code is where your business logic runs. It's a secret sauce that differentiates you from your competitors or from different teams or different people in the industry. Messages adds resiliency to our applications. If you are building distributed applications and you don't have a messaging component in there, you probably are going to be facing some downtime. So messaging adds resilience, and there's many different mechanisms and patterns that have been around for yonks. And of course, last but certainly not least, which is what I'm going to spend most of the time today talking about, is workflows and orchestrations. Yes, we can do everything in code, but how can we abstract as much of that away to a low-code, no-code platform to be able to orchestrate as much of the underlying parts of our end-to-end applications and those end-to-end integrations so that the actual provider takes care of all the complexity for us and we just tell it what to do when we need it to do it. So this is how the products of the Azure Integration Services Suite fits into those modern integration requirements. For all your eventing needs, you've got Event Grid. For ETL and data processing type functions, you've got Data Factory. For anything to do with publishing, managing, monitoring, and maintaining APIs, you've got API management. Functions is your serverless platform for running some code. You don't need any underlying application or infrastructure to run it. It just scales seamlessly on the functions platform. Service Bus is your enterprise grade messaging platform. And Logic Apps, last but not least, is your low-code, no-code orchestration platform. Now, before I go straight into Logic Apps, which I will spend the majority talking through as well as the updates, a quick step back to talk about when to use what for orchestration. Orchestration means a lot of things. Orchestration could be data orchestration, it could be application orchestration, or it could be just personal orchestration of your everyday tasks that you need to do. Now, we've got 3 different platforms specifically targeted at 3 different use cases. So for all things, batch or complex data orchestrations, that's where you'd use a Data Factory. Typically, if you need to, call out to, apply any machine learning, or you need to enrich data, or you've got data specific actions that you need to apply in a pipeline, that's typically best for Data Factory. And an example being, you've got a source, data source in SQL, and you run a pipeline across it, run some sort of procs, HT inside, calling out to that service, and then you do some transformations to put into a NoSQL database such as Cosmos DB. Logic Apps is an application orchestrator. Of course, it can do a lot of what Data Factory does, probably in a little bit more lightweight fashion than the heavy data ETL type orchestrations of Data Factory. But essentially, if you are creating enterprise-grade applications, enterprise integrations where you need HA, DR, any type of DevOps flow or a local developer environment, that's when you'll use Logic Apps. So an example being, an event happens, put something in a queue, Logic Apps will pick it up and do some processing of that. It might put something in your SAP system, it might pump some data into your orders application or custom service application, and then as a last point, put something into a SharePoint list. Last but not least, Power Automate, that's more of your business user, right? So if you want to orchestrate something within your team, maybe within your business unit, you've got a Power App that you've built that you've published out to your team, and you want to orchestrate a couple of bits and pieces behind the scenes there, or anything to do with RPA and automating the tasks that you would do as a human, Power Automate is great there. And an example being, pulling some data from some sort of service, putting in the common data service, which works great in the Power Platform, and then a Power App could be picking up those changes and presenting them to your business user. Now, you can all use them separately, but these things are all designed to work together in harmony. The main common factor across these different things is that they all use the Logic Apps engine under the hood. So the UI can look familiar at times, but use that and this kind of messaging to choose when to use what when you've got a particular integration scenario coming up on your radar. So diving into Logic Apps. If you haven't looked at Logic Apps before, you will definitely be well acquainted by the end of this talk. Logic Apps is essentially a low-code, no-code UI for orchestrating simple to complex integrations, particularly for applications, but it's enriched by our almost 400 out-of-the-box connectors. What these connectors are, and these are really the secret sauce of Logic Apps, the connectors essentially abstract away API calls to different services. Salesforce, anything on Azure, any other SaaS system you've got, ServiceNow. If you were to write your own integrations, for example, you want to integrate with Facebook. If Facebook changed their API, you would then have to change your integration. The connectors abstract all that away from you, so you just connect your connection, and it does all the heavy lifting for you in the back end. You just authenticate once and you're good to go. It's all a drag and drop interface so that you can kick it off with the trigger and then run a variety of actions to do certain things on your behalf as you go along. If you have already looked at Logic Apps before, you might notice that we have some changes. Now, currently these changes are under public preview, and I'll show you how to access those and have a play around with them. But essentially, the changes that I'm going to be demoing later today kind of fall into these 5 different buckets. So what we've done, and we announced it last year, around the middle of the year, was we moved our runtime onto the Azure Functions runtime. Now, we did that for a multitude of reasons. One was performance. So we've actually changed the way that our Logic Apps run. It's not so much a multi-tenant type infrastructure anymore. It is single-tenant, which means you can do a lot of funky things with that, and I'll get to that a little bit later. Running on the Azure Functions runtime gives you flexibility. You can run your Logic Apps wherever you can run functions today. So you can containerize your Logic Apps now. You can run them on App Service. You can run it on the Logic Apps resource, and you can even run it on an Elastic Premium type plan, which I'll showcase later. What this means is now you can run Logic Apps anywhere, since it's now a containerizable runtime, which means all those on-premises scenarios that you might not have been able to hit before, all of a sudden open up to integration specialists and generalists. Through the new re-platform, we've actually implemented a new designer. It's new, it's fresh, we've had UX experts look at the way that our customers are designing their workflows, and we have rejigged the designer accordingly. So we've got a nice pop-up panel. Things don't kind of jump around as much as they did, and it's got a nice fresh coat of paint. So I'm excited to show the case of that. We've got some more things coming out for integration specialists and generalists. One thing that many people are happy to note is inbuilt maps and schemas into the Logic Apps runtime itself. What that means is if you needed an integration account before to house your maps and schemas, you can now shut down that integration account and just use Logic Apps. So a lot of cost savings there and a lot of simplicity. Those maps and schemas now run locally with the Logic Apps resource, which means it's a lot more portable, which benefits many different things, including the DevOps process, which I'll also talk about a little bit later. I've mentioned improved execution of performance. We now have 2 ways of running your Logic Apps, stateless and stateful. Stateful is much like we were running Logic Apps before. Stateless is no external state storage. It's just local in memory, but they run 5x or etc. times faster than stateful. And of course, better connected. With running on the Azure Functions runtime, we do inherit all of those VNet connectivity services of app service and functions, such as VNet integrations and private endpoints. So it means if you were running on an ISC or were looking to run on an ISC, I would very much direct your focus to Logic Apps public preview and see what that can do for you. And I'll showcase what that kind of architecture will look like as we go along. So I've kind of gone through that quick speed because I would love to actually show rather than talk. So now I'm going to flick over to the Azure portal and we're actually going to see how this runs. So here I am in Azure, and just like I would create any other resource, I'm going to go create a Logic App from scratch. Now, a point to note here, right now in public preview, we do have these 2 resources, the original Logic Apps experience, which is not changing, is not going away, will remain, and the preview experience. Now, eventually, once we go GA, this will merge into one, so you won't have to worry about which one do I pick and when. We're going to merge them all together into the one end-to-end Logic Apps experience. Excellent. So if I want to create a new Logic App, I select the Logic App preview. I go ahead and create that, and it's going to take me to the creation page. I'm just going to put this in a resource group I already have. I'm going to give it a name, DIY demo. As I mentioned before, you can run your Logic Apps as containers, and Azure Logic Apps is one of the platforms that you can run said container. For now, I'm just going to run it as straight workflow.json code. I'm going to run it in Melbourne, where I am today. I'm going to choose where I want to host it. Right now, you can run it on any app service plan or the Functions Premium plan. I'm just going to run it on Functions Premium because I have one pre-created. It will create me a storage account on the side. This is a little bit of difference between the original Logic Apps and Logic Apps today. With running kind of a single tenant type architecture, it means we now give you the keys to the castle in terms of your storage. So you can apply all the storage security measures that you can to lock down your state of your Logic App and what you store in that storage account. That's absolutely up to you. You can bring your own storage account. So that's an improvement that we had over the original experience. Monitoring, we've also added support for application insights. So this does hook into all your other application components. So you can get that really nice end-to-end map of everything that's going on in your application platform. I'm going to link up to one that I might already have. And in case I'll just say no, because I've already got one. I'm going to review and create. And this, I'm just leaning around because I'm waiting for my button to pop up. Oh, I've given it the same name. Anyways, here's one I created earlier. So that usually takes about a couple of seconds to spin up, much like the original Logic App. So once you've spun up a Logic App, you can go and dive into the new Logic Apps experience. So straight off the bat, there's a couple of changes you might notice. Previously with Logic Apps, you kind of straight into the experience and you go into your designer and there's a workflow. Replatforming onto the Azure Functions runtime, there's a couple of different changes in the resource hierarchy. First change being you have multiple workflows to one Logic App. Much like with Azure Functions, you have a overarching function app host for hosting and billing purposes, and then you've got multiple functions within that function app. The exact same works for Logic Apps. You have one hierarchical Logic App and multiple workflows within that Logic App. So as an example, I can come down to my workflow tab here. And right now I've just got one workflow in my Logic App, but I can go ahead and create another one. As you can see here, the first thing we'll see is whether I want stateful or stateless. And really the choice really comes, do I want performance or do I need to keep my state? It comes down to what sort of workflows you're using. Of course, with two different ways of running your Logic Apps, we can talk about lots of fun patterns. So if you need to maintain state for the first bit of your particular integration, for example, something coming out of SAP, we really need to make sure that it's reliably distributed to a service bus. And then once it's on the service bus, it's kind of downstream processing from there. So we can have that first part of that workflow on stateful, and then the actual downstream processing of that could be stateless, just to kind of play around with some patterns there. For now, I'll just use stateful. I'll call this demo AzureDIY. I'm going to hit create there. I'll give this a couple of seconds. There we go. And now I can go jump in to my Logic Apps experience, which might look a bit familiar if you've used Logic Apps before. You've got your overview pane. If you do have a request type trigger, you'll eventually see a URL here. You'll see some of the metrics being exposed here. And of course, you've got the different tabs that you can drill into. As with the previous Logic App, it's still the same workflow.json definition, which means if you've already got Logic Apps that you've kind of started to author out, most of that it will be the same in the new experience. It's just a different designer overview. Cool, so this is a new look into the designer. So as you will see, it looks a little bit different. we have the card UI here, and then we've got the side panel UI to the side. The side panel is there to kind of simplify what is in the design pane to your left, so you can see more and you can do more complex rendering of your workflows. So parallel branching and kind of if-elsing and, you know, looping back to things that are kind of called at the beginning and then branched out at the end. There's a lot more that the engine can do to render more complex flows because of this new design change. So in this case, I'm just going to go the classic request response. I'm going to choose this particular trigger when a HTTP request is received. Something to call out here, you might have noticed we have two tabs, built-in and Azure. Azure is essentially those 300 plus connections that I mentioned earlier. These are the same ones that you'll be using for your Logic apps today. These run exactly the same. They're still that separate resource that is managed for you on the connections team behalf. Built-in, on the other hand, is actually running these actions and triggers locally within the Logic apps process. So your Azure connections are calling out to the managed connector infrastructure, making a call outside your Logic app as it is done today. Built-in stays all locally within your process, which means that if you're deploying things to via a container and deploying it on-prem, the traffic actually doesn't leave the Logic app unless you direct it to in one of your actions, of course. So these all run locally, they package up locally, which makes DevOps of these really nice. So we can do a whole bunch of fun and funky things in here. I'm just going to flick across to one that I've already created to show a more complex type designer flow. So this one is a kind of medium complexity Logic app. Essentially what it's doing, it takes an XML-based message. It'll transform that XML to JSON using one of my schemas that I have uploaded, and I'll show you how to actually call that locally within the Logic app. I'm going to pass some JSON. I'm just going to split this out into two arrays just to showcase what that flow looks like. You can still kind of close things and open things as you would before as this gets more complex. But if you click on a particular card, it's not going to go and break the whole view. It's just going to open up the details in the right-hand panel there. So let's showcase this running just to prove out that everything works. So here I've got my endpoint URL. I'm just going to go flick across to Postman to showcase this running in action. Alrighty. So I've already pre-pasted in my URL here, my post. I've got my XML structure here, and I've just hit send as I moved it across. And as you can see, it's spitting me out the JSON response that it's kind of done throughout that different workflow. I can still see the same monitoring view as I had in the original Logic Updates experience. So this is the one that I just ran. Another benefit here that I particularly liked is we have granular seconds now before we rounded it up or down for you, which is a little bit concerning when you had 0-second actions. So now you can see more of a granular type view of how long things are actually taking. And there you go, the response that you get on the other side. Cool. One thing to note, those schemas that I called out to in that particular flow, so if I just drill in here, traditionally, these types of connectors would need an integration account, but in this case, I'm just calling out to one of my locally run maps and schemas. So how you would upload those, either programmatically or via the portal, you've now got this particular pane here for schemas and maps. So actually, sorry, it's a map. So here I've uploaded my map, which is just a .liquid map. I can add it here, I can download them from here, and it means I don't have to call out or set up the integration account to do those typical transformations that you might need to do. So good news story there. For everything else, an integration account, such as partners and agreements, that will still remain in the integration account. Okay, so a recap of what I just demoed. So I've showcased the layout engine. I've shown the panel for action configuration. It's greatly simplified and enhanced what we can render in that designer view. There's more that you care about on the canvas rather than having to kind of open and close things to edit as you go. And we've optimized the engine for increased complex workflows. I've also showcased some advanced integration stuff. So I showed you the inbuilt maps and schemas. I've showed you built-in actions and the benefit of using those over some such as the Azure connectors. And I've talked through the difference between stateful and stateless and where you might want to use them and where they can be used in tandem. And now I'm going to flick over and put my developer hat on because we love developers here and talk about the new and enhanced developer experience. Now, so far I have been just demoing stuff from the portal, but I'm about to take a complete 180 and showcase what you would do if you were a developer in a team wanting to deploy enterprise-grade integrations at scale. So, some new changes that we have Visual Studio Code extension, which essentially runs the designer in the same way you've seen me run it on Azure, except now it's all through Visual Studio Code. It's really fast. It runs on the functions runtime as well. And we've got really cool things such as Breakpoint Debugging, which is something that I know a lot of folks have been asking for. We've now got it for actions. It's really cool, and I'll showcase that. As I mentioned, we do have application insights available, so you can get that application map and that full end-to-end debugging view of all the things that you're doing in your logic apps. In terms of building your own connectors, it's using the Azure Functions binding framework. So it's all kind of done via code, less XML, and you can actually kind of build them alongside and run them in your VS Code experience so that you can be building your connectors, running them locally, and calling them from your logic app all in one seamless experience. And DevOps improvements, which I'll talk through in a little bit as well. All right, so without further ado, I'll flick over to my developer environment, which I've pre-prepared for you earlier. So to get your logic apps running in your local environment in VS Code, you need to first step install the Azure Logic Apps preview extension. You might already have the Azure Logic Apps extension installed. This is a separate one for the new experience, so make sure you've done that. You'll also need your functions CLI tools if you don't already have them installed as well. They actually allow you to kind of function F5, run it locally, and do all the things that you do with functions if you've ever used it before. And then you can come in here, you can either create a new project from scratch, you can create a workflow, and of course you can deploy straight from Azure. But as we know, friends don't let friends right-click deploy. You do have that option if you need it for dev and POCing purposes, but also talk how you can fit this into a wider DevOps pipeline as well to get these up and running in your organizational ecosystem. Rightio, so here I've got the same workflow that I had on the portal, just implemented here. So you can see, the designer looks essentially the same. I've zoomed it in just to make it easier for you all to see. We still have the exact same panel layout. We can do all the things that we need to do there. So no changes there. We can also go straight and, do all this via code. If we wanted to, here you can see the ability to add breakpoints in as we run it. One of the biggest improvements of the new Logic Apps experience is being able to dev and test your Logic Apps locally. Previously, you had to have a running application on Azure before you could actually do any tests or make any changes. Here, it's all completely local. I mean, I happen to be using the same workflow I had on the portal, but this can be completely separate. You don't need to have something running in Azure. You can go develop locally, containerize this, deploy it to infrastructure of your choice, and it never hits Azure at all. And to test it, function F5 like you would any other application. This is going to run up the Azure Functions Runtime. We'll give that a couple of seconds to kick off. I'm going to go and navigate across to my Postman where I've already got the URL preloaded in there, and spoiler alert, it's working the same as it was on the portal. So that's just starting up here. You can see all those different endpoints like you would a function. if we want to go and see the monitoring view and how things are running locally, we've got the overview panel here. So right click overview, I'm just gonna drag that down. You can see all the runs that failed and succeeded. You can get the callback URL if you're using a request response type trigger. So in the case of me as a developer, I would copy this across, post it into my pasteman, send my body, and I'm gonna, there we go. This is a case where we can actually go in and actually, I know why. I need to copy this across. But if something, oh, there we go. If something fails like it does here, this is a great case for your breakpoint debugging. So breakpoint debugging today works just for actions, but in the future, we will be adding support for triggers. So we can go and breakpoint at any certain stage in here. If you get the end of that, there we go. So we've breakpointed at the pass JSON point. Go press hit. That's gonna, oh, it's not even hitting that endpoint. Let's go the. There we go. Let me have a think. Just turn it off and on again. That always helps. The classic case when people are watching a demo never works. All right, so I'm going to exit that and rerun that. I'll run my other workflow. So I've got one pre-created here. I'll hit that overview URI once that loads. Still up and running with my function, so this will take a couple of seconds. There we go. There we go. So that is now running. It must be something that I changed in my workflow. So let's go add a breakpoint in here. All right, let's hit that one again. That's going to hang because it has now hit my endpoint and it will show me all the inputs, all the outputs so that I can go and debug this from where to go. So this is a pretty cool feature. We're pretty excited about it. And it'll only be adding more features as we go along and as it matures. Excellent. So now let's talk about the DevOps experience. Now, I've made a couple of changes. Spoiler alert, I'll be talking about containers. So I've added a Docker file in here. As I mentioned, friends don't let friends right-click deploy, which you absolutely can do. You've got that functionality if you need it, but typically you would be deploying things through an end-to-end pipeline. So via VS Code, you can connect it to your source code repository of choice. In this case, I'm using GitHub. You would push up any changes that you have and then changes. And then typically you would have some sort of pipeline taking that and building it, testing it, and then deploying it out to Azure. Traditionally with Logic Apps, everything was coupled to the ARM template. You would have that workflow.json embedded in that ARM template. Of course, you can do some funky magic and have them in separate pipelines, but that was work that you had to do. With running on the Azure Functions runtime, it more naturally moves towards a state of infrastructure as a separate pipeline, and your application kind of gets treated as that zip deployment that can be, that immutable artifact that moves from environment to environment. So I will just grab up my GitHub over here so we can go see what that looks like. Great, move that across. So this is that repo that I was pushing out to. I've already got some GitHub actions enabled to go and deploy that application to my target environment. So in this case, I've got two. One I actually generated automatically via Deployment Center. which generated this for me, and one I just deployed myself. Now, if you've ever deployed to Azure Functions, this would look very familiar. Now you're doing a build action where you are just essentially packaging up that logic app into a zip. And then in this case, I'm reusing the Azure Functions action. On our roadmap, we do have plans to create our own logic apps action. So you'll just be able to run the logic apps GitHub action, and then it'll all deploy out to your logic apps environment using a publisher profile, much like what app service and functions do today. That being said, you are not locked into using GitHub Actions. This is just an example of how we're making it easier for developers to deploy their applications to Azure. But at the end of the day, it's just a zip deploy. So wherever you can do that from, you can deploy your logic apps via programmatic means. And of course, everything under the hood, the infrastructure, the connectors can be defined via ARM templates or by Bicep or by Terraform as well, and can be deployed via a programmatic pipeline, much like you would with your other resources. I could go on for a long time about DevOps. It's probably worth a whole other session itself. So if there is demand for that, I mean, Sri, I'm happy to come back for season 4 and talk through it in more depth, but that's just a bit of a teaser of some of the improvements we've made for DevOps. Some other things that are worth noting out, I'm going to flick back to the portal so you can see some of the other features. We now have support for deployment slots, so things like blue-green deployment is now there. Deployment Center is something we're looking to light up. The first action will be to have our GitHub action, and then once we've got that, Deployment Center will be an end-to-end way of configuring these pipelines for your logic apps, and a whole bunch more. Time check, I've got a couple more demos, and then I will look to start answering questions in about 10 minutes. Excellent. So we talked about the new experience, both on the portal and via VS Code. We've talked about how you can DevOps your logic apps from a very high level. Now let's talk about the options to run your logic apps. Now, traditionally with logic apps, you had the option to run on kind of in that consumption mode, just as is on the logic apps resource, or via an ISE. Today with V2, these are the different mechanisms of hosting and deploying a logic app. And I say today with the preview version. This may tweak a little bit coming up to GA, but essentially how you can run your logic apps is via the normal mechanisms as you would today. On an app service plan, as I showcased earlier, on an Azure Functions premium plan, which kind of takes into account scale, performance, availability, and all that stuff. On Azure Stack as a container, because the Azure Functions runtime is containerizable, therefore we inherit that, and you can containerize your complete logic app. Everything within that logic app, the workflows, the built-in actions, and the schemas and maps will all be a part of that nice bundle. So it makes it really nice to run everywhere. And of course, wherever else you can deploy your containers, such as IoT Edge. Do have a little note at the bottom. There is an awesome session coming up in week 3 where Duncan will be talking about how to run serverless for the enterprise. And it'll go through in a lot more detail how to run your serverless applications, as well as how to network them up, which I'll talk through after this. So as mentioned, you can containerize your logic apps. I will quickly flick across to the demo to showcase how that works. I won't go through the full end-to-end view as I'm aware of time, but essentially, like you would a function, you can even use the function tools. You create a Docker file, you kind of pull in all the different dependencies that you need to run this. You've got your storage account where you'll keep your state and some of the metadata of the logic apps if you're running stateless. The typical commands you would make to get this up and running. Let me close this. It's frozen. Okay. All right. Some typical command to make. I can do docker build it as a container that's going to read that Docker file, package it all up into my container image, and then I can go run that locally, test it, hit that endpoint as I would just to see that the actual end-to-end thing is working. That takes a couple of seconds. I've actually gone ahead and pre-run that Docker container. It's running on port 8089. And here's once again one I've created earlier. And as you can see, this is actually calling my container endpoint, and I'm getting the same response from that workflow as I was getting from one that I was running locally, and that's all running in a container. And as we know, once you've got a running container, it can run anywhere. So all fun and games there. So essentially what you would do after you've containerized your containerized your logic app is what you would do for any other container. You might put this into something like GitHub or your repos, or to check in the code. Your pipeline could go ahead and run those different container or Docker commands, push it into a container registry of some sorts, and then in your deployment pipeline to pull that image and deploy out to your environment of choice, whether that be AKS, logic apps, as I showcased earlier, app service, or even on-prem, or wherever you need that container to run. The crux of that slide is wherever you need your integrations, that's where you should be running your logic apps. And of course, with App Insights, you can still get insights into all those containers running, much like you would any other container that you run. But of course, use the tools that you're currently using with containers. We run through that demo, and we've got just enough time for one more demo, because I know that this is a question that comes up quite a bit, and that is, how do I connect my logic apps to my, it's all well and good to create workflows that kind of talk to things in Azure or things in PaaS and stuff like that. What if we want to talk to a SQL box that's sitting on-prem? Well, you could previously with something called an ISE. Now, ISEs are very powerful, very scalable, very performant, but they also come with a bit of a price tag. So if that price tag was blocking you from from logic app usage before, logic app preview might be the way forward. So essentially, running on the Azure Functions Runtime, we do inherit all of those rich and enterprise-ready networking capabilities. So once again, I would say stay tuned for week 3, which will go into this particular architecture in a lot more detail. But for logic apps in particular, this is a example network configuration of how you can essentially inject your logic apps into your VNet to be able to talk via private address space to your on-premises applications or applications behind a firewall or in your private address range. For inbound traffic, you can apply private endpoints to your logic apps. So essentially that gives it a private IP that your VNet connected applications can talk out to. This is relevant for things like request response and things like that. For outbound connectivity, i.e. your logic app needs to talk to a SQL box on-prem, you can apply VNet integrations. And essentially what that does, it's kind of, you point to a delegated subnet within your virtual network. We inject the virtual NIC of that particular application onto that delegated subnet so that your outbound traffic now goes by that subnet and then outbound via your gateways or your firewalls and everything to go where it needs to go. And of course, to talk to other services that you would like to protect, such as Azure Storage or Cosmos DB, with VNet integrations, you can then talk out to those private endpoints or use something like service endpoints as an alternative to that. I breezed through that, but I will say stay tuned for more serverless for the enterprise coming up in a couple of weeks. Just to quickly demonstrate, you can still see it at the bottom. To quickly demonstrate some of those networking capabilities, I'll head over to the networking tab. And as you can see, we've got VNet integrations, private endpoints, hybrid connections if needed, and a whole bunch of other things, access restrictions as similar to what we had before. So to configure this, you essentially pointed at a VNet, you pointed at a delegated subnet, and the underlying application infrastructure takes care of the rest. And a similar case for private endpoints. You'd create one, you point it to the resource, and it goes and creates that private endpoint resource for you. I won't go through that end to end because I'm keen to get to any outstanding questions if there are any. If there aren't any, I would recommend putting some in there. For more information on networking, I have got a couple of resources which if these slides are made available, will be there. Otherwise, take a screenshot of this. So what we have is one of my colleagues, very, very smart man, has put out a blog on all the intricacies of how to set up your Logic app for network connectivity. And we've also got some samples. So we've got all the ARM templates to be able to set up this configuration ready to go. So you can go to this sample, run this in your environment so that you've got that end-to-end configuration, as I've just talked through, all ready to go without you having to put all the pieces together. The demo networking, something I'll talk about, I will flick over to questions soon, is the BizTalk migration toolkit. If your organization is running BizTalk and you're looking to modernize, we now have a toolkit to help you along the way. Essentially what the toolkit does is it turns BizTalk applications into Azure integration services. So targeting Logic Apps, APIM, Service Bus, and more, to be able to take the functionality that you had with BizTalk and apply a modern twist on it. It is open source and it is on GitHub. So if you want to, you can absolutely contribute and give back to the community. We have a lot of folks working to add new functionality and features onto it. There are limitations of what it can do, but if you have any asks, if you have any use cases, absolutely reach out to myself. I will send out my email. I'll pop it on the slide. If you want to write it down, it's relyons@microsoft.com. And we'll be happy to help you out with those BizTalk migrations. Okay, 9 minutes ago, I'm going to flick over to my Teams tab to see if I've missed any questions.
There are a lot of questions, Beck.
Oh, goodness.
So
Yes.
the most common one that's come up about 4 times is when is the GA date for Logic Apps going?
Yes, so I can't give any specific data, but it will be this half of the year.
All right, fantastic. We also had a question if Visual Studio 2019 will be supported as well.
It's on the roadmap, but it won't be coming for GA.
Feel free to also look through the questions as well. I'm trying to handpick them.
I'll jump in with a quick couple help out answers. There's lots of questions, Beck. Everyone's loving the presentation. Thank you very much.
Excellent. No worries.
Can we run this disconnected on premise in the new version?
So something that we're working on, and I know that John Fancy, who's also on the Logic Apps team, has mentioned it in a couple of other seminars like this. So I'm not as hesitant to talk about it, is we are working on some storage alternatives. So right now we do have a dependency on Azure Storage, but come GA we will have other options so that you'll be able to run your Logic Apps disconnected.
Cool.
How will the workflow reorganization of Logic Apps affect the large number of discrete Logic Apps we have once this becomes GA?
Well, let me have a look at that. Can you read that out again?
How will the workflow reorganization of Logic Apps affect the large number of discrete Logic Apps we have once this becomes GA? I think it's saying once you merge the two.
Right, so nothing will happen to your existing Logic Apps. Under the hood, we'll make improvements to the platform, but that will be a seamless migration that you will not see as a user of Logic Apps. There will be an opt-in migration path if you do want the new capabilities and features, and there will be pathways to move your workflows to this new hierarchy. So you're not going to be forced into it. It will be opt-in, and there will be a mechanism to do so.
Fantastic.
And then, building on that, how you break up those discrete Logic Apps and how you group them into different Logic App resources purely comes down to the design of your application. Like, you might group them up based on project, you might group them up based on pattern. It really depends. Fantastic.
Another one is in the roadmap to provide a UI low-code environment for creating the transformation maps.
low-code environment. That is also something we are looking into. It won't be there for GA, but we are aware of that type of ask. If you have any feedback on what you would like to see, I've read out my email, but I'll try and find a UI that I can kind of send my email out where we love your feedback. So if there's anything like the mapping capabilities that you would like to see, yeah, we're all ears and we would love to hear your thoughts. I've got one that I would like to address. So the rate limiting is something that will be improved. So the question is, the biggest blocker when it comes to using logic apps if data operation is SQL DBs, it's rate limiting. I'm not going to read it all. Yep, so essentially the rate limiting is there because, as I mentioned, the Azure Connections is kind of like logic apps today. It's a multi-tenant service. It's a shared resource across all our different connections. So we do have rate limiting in place to make sure that we have enough room for everyone to use the service. With built-in actions, so SQL Server, the SQL connection is an example of one of those built-in actions. There's no rate limiting in that because it's kind of running in your plan on your infrastructure. How you scale that is absolutely up to you. So those rate limits are removed. Something to call out with built-in and Azure connectors, there currently is not, there will be more parity as we go towards GA, but our goal within the Logic Apps team is to have built-in actions for the most common connections that you want to use, and have all the different actions and triggers that are needed. So if there's something that you need that's not in those, as I mentioned, let us know, and we can bring that up to parity as we go along.
Another one, is there a capability to programmatically write unit test cases / unit testing framework for logic apps?
In terms of writing the unit test, I might put that part of the question to the side. In terms of having unit tests and creating them and testing them, while we don't have a framework, it is also something we're aware of and building towards. So we are aware of it. And once again, I sound like a broken record here. If you have something that you want, absolutely spam me. I'm not sure how many people on the call, so I might regret saying that. But you can unit test your logic apps, and there are patterns in place that you can work around some of the connectors that are harder to unit test. For example, the event grid trigger. That's kind of hard to unit test, right? Like, how do you trigger that? How do you make that work? And a pattern that you can use is kind of decouple the trigger from the actual business logic. So you would have one logic app, so one workflow within your logic app that has your event grid trigger and then calls the child logic app. That child logic app is just a HTTP request, which will work in a unit testing type framework. So you can hit that with some dummy data that emulates the data that would be coming in from an event grid, and then that would be the basis for your unit tests. There are some nice third-party blogs out there that kind of go through this, but it is something that the whole end-to-end DevOps process is something that we are looking at and putting a lot of resources into. So expect some improvements there over time. I'll have a look at another one.
So while we're looking for more questions,
yes,
we've gotten a lot of remarks about what a brilliant presenter Beck has been and how we want more from Beck. So while it's great to have those in the Q&A, we do have a feedback form at the end that Beck will flick to later. So please make sure to put your feedback there.
Yes, absolutely. And don't put your product feedback there. Give your product feedback directly to me. Your feedback on the presentation, feedback on the product to me. That would be very helpful. So yeah, look, on the DevOps side of things, I'm myself and Derek, who's the other PM on Logic Apps. We've got a number of them as well. Derek and I work a lot on the developer side of things. We're going to be filming a vlog going through the DevOps side. So that's going to be available lighting up within the next couple of weeks, as well as a blog on all of the DevOps capabilities, as well as a bit of a sneak peek into what is coming. So you've got that to look forward to. But also, if I will come back by popular demand, I will happily present back at season 4. And yes, so that is coming. I've realized we're at time. I might try and answer one more question. If there is a burning question,
I think there's a good question that's just been published. What are the general limitations of using logic apps, preview or current, plus PaaS services via private endpoint, plus VNet, plus VPN or express route connections to on-premise versus using an ISE?
Peter, I was looking for a 1-minute answer. I think that's a perfect segue to say stay tuned for week 3. It might not be logic app specific, but I mean, sorry, Duncan, if I'm overselling your presentation, but it will go through all the different ways to configure your serverless applications that will help answer your questions there. If not, then I'll be on that call and then I'll try and answer the question. We'll see.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Beck. This has been amazing, just grabbing it. Remember to try and join the LinkedIn page to stay up to date with anything that's coming along. Just scan the QR code there. But definitely give feedback. Just flick back one, Beck, because I think that's probably the most important one, to give you feedback with the QR code one slide back.
More important than LinkedIn.
Yeah. Definitely try and give feedback if you can on this session, and send AzureDIY to your friends and colleagues. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.